Once this goes live.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Ephraim, as always.
Now you start recording.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.
Just click this OK over here.
No, it says leave meeting.
No. Great.
Okay, here we go.
Then you close it. Then
Right at the end.
start recording.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our series on War and Peace in Jewish tradition. Tonight, we are going to be looking at many different aspects of Mashiach, the greatly anticipated Redeemer, Mashiach, and we're going to delve into many different aspects, different opinions, different traditions about Mashiach. And I can't say I ordered it in a specific way. I just wrote down notes and I'll present them according to how I wrote them down. They're not in any really specific order. So I want to start with, and many of these concepts will be familiar to people, and hopefully we can reveal even newer insights. So we're going to start with a concept that is very important to when the Mashiach will come. And this is a verse from Yeshayahu, Isaiah. It's 62:22, chapter 62, verse 22. But I'm going to read a little bit before. I should mention that it's written in a number of places that after Moshe, the most important of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, was Isaiah. We can't even measure his how much he contributed to Jewish tradition, how many verses from Isaiah became part of the prayers, became part of concepts and ideas. And so here in this verse, I'm going to go back a little bit, and we should know that if you remember, when we learned from Rambam about the Mashiach, he said the whole concept of Mashiach, we don't have to even bring a lot of proofs because all of the Nevi'im spoke about a future Redeemer, that we use the term Mashiach. And so, especially the book of Isaiah has all kinds of warnings, all kinds of rebuke, but it is so full of promises of redemption for the future. And so many of them, like I said, are quoted frequently. So here, I'm just going a little bit before the verse I want to get to. So he says like this: the sun shall be no more thy light by day, neither for brightness shall the moon give light to you. But God shall be to you an everlasting light, and your God your glory. The sun shall no more go down, nor shall the moon withdraw itself. For God shall be your everlasting light, and the days of your mourning shall be ended. Your people also shall be all righteous. Now, what I'm reading right now is quoted in Pirkei Avot between all of the chapters. This verse that the next two verses that we're going to read. Your people also shall all be righteous. They shall inherit the land forever. They shall be the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, that I may be glorified. This comes between every chapter of Pirkei Avot. The least one shall become 1,000, and the smallest one a strong nation. And this is the part I want to get to. I, God, will hasten it in its time. The ita achishena. In its time, I will hasten it. So the sages ask, this sounds contradictory. If it's in its time, how can it be hastened? And if it can be hastened, how can you say there's a time? So the sages answered very simply. If we merit, we can hasten the coming of Mashiach. And if not, there is a set time and it will happen, even if we don't merit it. So this is a very, very important concept that runs throughout all of Jewish history, this idea that if we would merit, then Mashiach would come. So the Gemara discusses, well, what do we have to do to hasten it? What will hasten it? So in two different Gemaras, in Sanhedrin 99b and Baba Batra 8a, they bring the same opinion that learning Torah hastens the redemption. The more Torah that is learned, the more the redemption will be brought closer. The Zohar says something similar, but a little different. It says about itself. It says, those who learn the secrets in the Zohar will help bring redemption with compassion. They add this idea of the redemption coming through compassion. As we learned already, this idea that there's predicted perhaps very, very traumatic wars before the coming of Mashiach. But as we learned, the general principle of all prophecy is none of the, we'll call it bad prophecies or negative predictions have to happen. All the good predictions and prophecies are guaranteed to happen. So the idea of these wars before Mashiach, it's only if certain forces are at play that we can avoid it. So the Zohar is saying, by learning the secrets of the Zohar, this can bring redemption with compassion, without necessarily all of the traumatic wars that are predicted. So this idea of Ita Achishena is a very, very important idea, and we will be returning to it as we go through different ideas of Mashiach. So this is very, very connected to a very, very fundamental debate that happened among the Jewish people just about 100 years ago at the beginning of the Zionist movement, where among the religious, there was really a split of opinion whether we should actively try to come back to Eretz Yisrael, or we should wait for God to just make it happen. That God would move things, and it would be clear to everyone that it was time to come back to Eretz Yisrael. in the 1920s, at the beginning of the Zionist movement, there was a lot of debate. And so in a certain way, it's connected with this idea, how much should we do to try to hasten the final redemption? Because returning to Eretz Yisrael is one of the signs of redemption. Now, among the non-religious, this wasn't such a big debate. It was a political movement to try to solve the terrible conditions that the Jews had been living in mostly Europe for many, many, many centuries. And so here was an attempt, a political attempt. But among the religious, it was also a debate about the religious ramifications of coming back to Eretz Yisrael without clear signs from, let's say, from heaven that this was the right time. So I'm just mentioning that this idea of Be'ita Achishena is a very, very important idea. As far as, well, so what is the time? What is the set time? Well, as Rambam said, and we learned, no one knows what God's set time is, other than God reveals that there is a set time. Probably the idea that's most quoted or people have in their consciousness is the year 6000. That there are many, many traditions that just like there are 6 days of creation and then Shabbat, the seventh day, and there's 6 days of working the land, and there's the Shemitah, that there's this idea that there'll be 6,000 years of history, which will culminate in the 7th millennium, which is the Messianic era. So this is the most common idea about a set time. And so it's interesting that one of the important sources of this is that in the first verse of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In that verse, there are 6 alephs, 6 letters aleph. And we know that aleph also means elef, 1,000. And so the sages pointed out that the 6 alephs in the first verse is like it's engraved into we'll call it the hard drive of history, that there will be 6,000 years of history as we know it, and then will come the 7,000th year. Again, many of these ideas we will be returning to in greater depth. So one of the ideas that we already mentioned last week when we went through the Rambam and his understanding of Mashiach was that in his 13 principles of faith, the 12th one is the belief in the coming of Mashiach. And even if it takes a long time, still we will wait for it. We will wait for it. And so we see that way before the Rambam, and this is certainly one of the reasons that he included in the principles of faith, when the Anshe Knesset Gedola established the prayer called the Amidah, the standing prayer. Sometimes we call it the silent prayer. And there were 18 blessings, and then a 19th one was added. But one of them is, well, actually, I'll mention 2. Now, the Anshe Knesset Gedola is 2,300 years ago when this prayer was established. And so Rambam comes around 1,300 years after the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. And so the two blessings in the Shmona Esrei, the Amida, the first one is V'Yerushalayim Ircha Barachamim Tashuv, and Jerusalem, your city, please return with compassion, V'Tishkom B'tocha Kasher Dibarta, and dwell in it as you promised, as you said you would. Uvenei ota b'karov b'yameinu, and build it quickly in our days, binyan olam, an everlasting building, an everlasting holy city. Now, obviously, this is including the holy temple. The kisei David avdecha meheru l'tocha tochin, and the throne of David, your servant, quickly may it be established. And then we say, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, God, who builds Jerusalem. So here we see already this idea of incorporating 3 times a day, not only the rebuilding Yerushalayim, but that the throne of David should be established. Now, of course, we call Mashiach ben David. And as the Rambam taught us, that Mashiach will come from David. So here already we see, we'll call it a principle of faith, that God promised us that he would dwell again in Yerushalayim. And so we are, in a sense, reminding him and praying that it should be manifest. And then the next one is more specifically about a redeemer. It doesn't use the word Mashiach, but it's about a redeemer. Here it says, Et semach David avdecha mehera tatzmiach. And the shoot of David, your servant, quickly let it sprout. V'karno tarum yeshuatecha, and his horn, that it should be raised up in your salvation. Ki liyeshuatcha kivinu kol hayom, because in your salvation we hope all the day. Umatzpim liyeshua, and we look forward, we anticipate your redemption. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, God, matzmiach keren Yeshua, who will make sprout the horn of redemption. The horn here is very connected to the shofar. And we have this tradition that when Mashiach comes, there'll be the sound of what's called the great shofar, shofar gadol, l'cherutenu, for our freedom. So here we see this idea of going all the ways back to the establishment of the prayers as we know them today, mentioning in both of these blessings the idea of the sprout of David to be reestablished and to bring salvation and redemption to the world. Also, in our prayers every day in the Aleinu, we ask God, l'takein olam b'malchut shakai, to rectify the world in the kingdom of God. This is in the Aleinu. We say it 3 times a day. And here I just want to point out that the Aleinu ends, V'ne'amar v'hoya l'Shem l'melech al kol ha'oretz v'yom hahu yeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad. That in the future God will be king over all the earth, and he and his name will be one. And so the Aleinu is a very messianic prayer. We end every prayer service with the Aleinu. And so every day, this idea of praying for rectification of the world. So this is very connected to the whole concept of Mashiach, because when Mashiach comes, this begins what we call the rectification of the world and the revelation of God, just like we just read from Isaiah, that the light of God in the Messianic era will be palpable. The human consciousness will change so dramatically to be able to integrate and be a proper vessel for the light of God. So the idea of Mashiach and Tikkun are intrinsically woven together. Okay, then there is another tradition that this is brought in Masechet Sota, that it speaks about different things that will happen before Mashiach comes. I'm only going to mention one now. There's a whole string of not positive events that will occur. And in general, it's just describing what's called the Yerida Hadorot, the descent of the generations. In other words, we'll say almost paradoxically, ironically, the closer we get to Mashiach, the more the world will be in desperate need for Mashiach because of a huge descent of morals and ethics and what's called derech eretz, just pure manners between peoples and generations. And there it mentions that Mashiach will come either to a generation that's kulo zakai or kulo chayav, either to a generation that is all meritorious or all what's the right word here? All not deserving, put it that way. People who are not deserving of redemption. So here we'll ask, whoa, how does that work? And this is very connected to what we began with, Be'ita Achishena. In other words, if it's a generation that merits the Mashiach, then we could, not only will it happen in its time, but we could bring it sooner. And if it's a generation that's all chayav, in other words, it's all, I don't know, use the word guilty, but it's just not on the level, then Mashiach could also come. So we'd ask, well, why would Mashiach come when no one deserves it? And so this is connected to the tradition that we have, that when we were in Egypt, we had, because of the the slavery and the oppression and the pressure and the influence of Egyptian society, Israel had fallen to the 49th level of impurity. And the Midrash says that God acted then because symbolically, if we would have fallen to the 50th level of impurity, as it were, God would not have been able to pull us out of there. Now, obviously, God can do anything, but just metaphorically, that if we fall too far, we can't be redeemed. So when we reached the 49th level, there was only one more level to go, the 50th level. God pulled us out of there. So this idea here is the same thing, that would it be that we merited Mashiach coming and merited to bring it even sooner? But even if we have no merits, God has promised there will be a redemption, be'ita, in its time, if we deserve it or don't deserve it. So going along with this, there is this idea that we discussed last week, and we'll go into it a little bit more now, is that the question is, how miraculous will the coming of Mashiach be? If you remember, we learned that Rambam held that it will come in a natural way. It will be part of the historical development, part of politics, just natural development will lead to Mashiach coming. And others hold it will be far more miraculous. And so there's two different prophecies. One says that the Redeemer will come from the clouds in the sky. It will come miraculously. He'll be revealed through miracles. And the other one is he'll be coming. This is a very well-known metaphor, that he'll come riding on a donkey, meaning not in a miraculous way. He'll come, but it won't be in a miraculous way. And so this is put together with this idea of Be'ita Achishana. If we merit to bring it sooner, if it's a generation that has many merits, the more merits we have, the more miraculous the revelation of Mashiach will be. And the less merits that we have, then it will be less miraculous. And most of the commentators subscribe to this idea, this explanation of having one verse saying Mashiach will come like a miracle from the sky, and the other riding on a lowly donkey. So the Rambam, interestingly enough, in what we learned last week in Mishnah Torah, so he very much emphasized this idea of Mashiach coming in a natural way. And he even quoted the opinion of Shmuel that the only difference between before Mashiach comes and afterwards is that Israel will no longer be under the subjugation of the nations of the world, which will be a huge change. So we could say it's natural, but when we think about Jewish history and everything we've been through with the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Greeks and the Persians and the Romans, and go through communities around the world that we've been under the subjugation of the nations. And even now, it's Israel is under constant, like under a microscope, and everyone knows what happens at the United Nations when votes are brought up. And it's almost like the only thing the United Nations has to discuss is Israel, as if there's no other problems in the world. So that's what Rambam brings, that the only difference will be that will no longer be under this subjugation. But as we said, that would be a huge, huge change. We could even call it a miracle, But that's what Rambam says in the Mishnah Torah. But in his day, and like many generations, there were false Mashiachs, different people who would pop up and either declare they were Mashiach, or other people would think they're Mashiach. And so the Rambam wrote a famous letter to the people of Taiman, of Yemen, about this whole matter of Mashiach and false Mashiachs. And there he actually gives over this idea that he also subscribed to this idea that if we would merit, Mashiach would come in a more miraculous way. And if you remember at the end of our learning of Rambam, when he describes what it will be like in the Messianic era, so we see that it almost seemed like a contradiction because it didn't seem natural at all. Human consciousness would change so dramatically. There'd be no more war, no more competition, no more hatred. Delicacies would be just everywhere. And he said that the only occupation in the entire world, not just among the Jewish people, would be to know God, and that the knowledge of God would cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. That's how he ends. So we see that doesn't sound very natural. That sounds like very miraculous. So in his letter to Teman, he brings this other idea, that it is possible that it will be more miraculous. Then comes the idea, very connected to all of this, a very, very big debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua on the importance of tshuva in bringing Mashiach. Rabbi Eliezer says explicitly, we will only merit redemption if we do tshuva. If we don't do tshuva, we will not be redeemed. Rabbi Yeshua was more of the ideas, be'ita. Even if we don't necessarily do tshuva, there is a set time. And they go back and forth, and Rabbi Yeshua even agrees with Rabbi Eliezer that we do have to do tshuva. But he says that if we don't do it ourselves, he says God will bring a tyrant, an enemy like Haman, that will force us to do tshuva. In other words, he would almost agree with Rabbi Eliezer. It would be better if we did it on our own and bring the redemption. But even if we don't do tshuva, God will put us in a position that we have to do tshuva. That's the whole story of the Megillah of Purim. But then there are others that, and Rambam says, if we do tshuva, we'll immediately be redeemed. And we also have the opinion that many, many people have heard, and there's two different opinions. One says if all of Israel would keep 2 successive Shabbats, we would be redeemed. There's another opinion that says if we would keep even 1 Shabbat, all of Israel would keep even 1 Shabbat, then the world would be redeemed. The Jewish people would be redeemed. So here you have a typical thing. Okay, is it 1 Shabbat or is it 2? And so I remember I learned it in the Netivat Shalom from the Slonim Rebbe. I don't think he's the only one to say this. He says it's not necessarily a contradiction, because Shabbat has 2 aspects called Shamor v'Zachor. This is in the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. In the first one, it says Zachor, and in the second one, it says Shamor, to remember the Shabbat, and the other one says to keep or observe the Shabbat. And this is in the beginning of the beloved song, Lecha Dodi, on Kabbalat Shabbat. Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. That it's as if God said, guard and remember Shabbat in one word, because it's like one concept. It's 2 sides of the same coin. Zachor is all of the, we'll call it the positive aspects of Shabbat, and the Shamor are all the prohibitive things that we don't do, which actually lead to all of the positive things that we're able to experience. So it's really two sides of the same coin. And so the one, you can understand what it says, 2 Shabbats. Oh, okay. Okay, my wife always is great with props. Okay, this is a challah cover from a good friend of ours, Chaya Leader, made this, and then my wife made the background around it. But if you see, there's 2 colors of blue here. And if you look carefully, it says 2 different words, Shamor v'Zachor. The darker blue spells Zachor, and both colors together spell Shamor. B'dibur echad, in one saying. This is like so super creative. And thank you, Chaya Leader, for doing that, and thank my wife for making the border around it. So therefore, it doesn't have to be a contradiction, but the idea is if all of Israel would keep one Shabbat, that would bring Mashiach. And many of you are probably aware that in the last 5 years, there's what's called the Shabbat Project. It started in South Africa. The chief rabbi of South Africa began just in South Africa of encouraging every Jew, doesn't matter, unaffiliated, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Renewal, whatever, everyone do something on the same Shabbat. So they picked a date and they tried to get everyone to do something, invite people, do programs, and then it spread all around the world. But really, I think 30 or 40 years ago, there was a similar attempt in the United States. I think it was called Shabbat Around the World. It was a similar idea to get as many people as possible. And I think this last year, there was something like, I'm just guessing, something like 2,000 different congregations or organizations that participated in some way, shape, or form with doing something on the same Shabbat. And the idea behind it, of course, the idea is just to get people involved in Shabbat. But on a very deep, call it even a spiritual, mystical level, this idea that this could actually bring the redemption that much closer. Now, I remember talking about a set time. Again, I'm quoting the Slonim Rebbe in Netivat Shalom and Parshat Ha'azinu, where Ha'azinu, it's considered, the Ramban said the entire history of the world and every person's place in it and every generation is included in this song, Ha'azinu. And if you look at just the simple words, it starts from the creation and it goes to Israel coming out of Egypt, coming into the land, as it says, growing fat and rebelling. And then the enemies come and destroy the temple. And it's all in Ha'azinu. And at the end, it just ends saying that in the end, God will redeem his people. And it ends like that. And in one of the Torahs from the Slonim Rebbe, he says, in a certain way, this is the highest parsha of the Torah. Why? Because in Ha'azinu, it doesn't say that we have to do tshuva, we have to merit. It just simply says that in the end, even though we rebelled and we ran after idols and we didn't listen to God, but in the end, God will not break his covenant with us and he will keep his promise and bring the redemption. Okay, so now I'm going to mention a number of things that we've mentioned before many times, but since we're concentrating all of our learning tonight about Mashiach. So one of the most important teachings of the Baal Shem Tov was that we all have a spark of Mashiach, a messianic spark. And right before the Torah was given, so God said that you'll be a goy kadosh, a holy nation, and an am kohanim, and a nation of priests, of kohanim. Well, we know we're not all kohanim. Relatively very few are kohanim. So what does it mean? You'll be a nation of kohanim. So the idea is that just like the kohanim were the servants of God, they did the service in the temple. They represented of all of Israel. It's actually in this week's Torah portion when the high priest had on his two shoulders 2 stones that had the names of all the tribes. And then he wore a breastplate that had the names of all of the tribes on 12 stones. The Kohen Gadol was carrying all of Israel on his shoulders, quite literally. This metaphor of carrying the world on our shoulders is very connected to the clothing of the high priest. And so this idea from the Baal Shem Tov that we all have a spark of Mashiach is the idea of being a nation of Kohanim is a leader nation, the spiritual leaders of the world. And that's why Isaiah, in 2 words, gave us our national mission, or Goyim, a light unto the nations. And so that is the spark that the Baal Shem Tov was talking about, that each Jew has a spark that is a leadership spark. And so this is connected to really one of my favorite teachings from Rav Ginsburg, where he teaches that when enough people have activated, elevated, purified, manifest their specific spark of Mashiach, meaning their potential and their light in the world, it will create a critical mass of spiritual energy, which will draw the soul of Mashiach into the world. So this is a very, very important idea, because we all can contribute. We all can contribute. And in truth, every human being, especially those who subscribe to the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, meaning they believe in God, they don't believe in any other force other than God, they're moral and ethical and good people, they also have a light to share. And so, again, when enough people can activate this goodness, remember the first time the word good is mentioned in the Torah is connected with light. God created light, and it said, and God saw the light that it was good. So this idea, again, of us being able to merit and to hasten the coming of Mashiach. So this, of course, was a major teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. And the whole Hasidic movement, in a certain way, is messianic in its very nature. And if we even go back a little bit earlier, the Baal Shem Tov was born in 1698. And he died in 1760. But in the middle 1500s, so the Arizal and the Kabbalists of Tzfat, the Arizal said very, very clearly that there was a huge change happening in Jewish history, and the beginning of the historical development that would bring Mashiach was starting in motion. And we know that the Baal Shem Tov, he was able to take the teachings of the Arizal and we'll call it reformulate to create a new language that would be much more accessible. The language of the Arizal was highly complex and Kabbalistic, and there was really, he made no attempt to reach the masses, put it that way. But the Baal Shem Tov wanted to reach the masses. So he took these very deep concepts and he reframed them in a new language that could be understandable. And this is the basis of the Hasidic movement. It's known that especially the last approximately 10 years of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's life, he was promoting very, very, very much that people should be conscious and aware of our ability and responsibility to try to hasten the coming of Mashiach. And so one of his last teachings about this was a very well-known teaching on the 28th of Nisan. This was not that long before he had his series of strokes that ended up ending his life. But he taught when he said to a shocked audience, when he said, "I've done everything I can to bring Mashiach. Now the responsibility is in your hands." So you can imagine the earthquake that caused within Chabad. But then as part of that whole teaching, he said, what I can tell you is that almost like the main ingredient, the main way to bring Mashiach is to take orot de tohu, bekelim de tikkun. The lights of tohu, the previous world, the world that the lights were so strong and pure and holy that the initial vessels of that world, the world of tohu, could not contain them, and they shattered. That's what's called shvirat hakelim, the breaking of the vessels. And that this world is called olam hatikun, the world of rectification. And so the Lubavitcher Rebbe taught in the world of tohu, the lights were tremendous, and the vessels were few, and use the word immature. They couldn't hold the light. This world, the lights are relatively very few, and the vessels are everywhere because it's a material, physical world. So he said that the secret of bringing Mashiach is that we have to take this incredible light, this awesome transcendental light of tohu, and create vessels that can hold it. So that was the advice of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that we need more light, but we need vessels that can hold the light. So speaking of this, we have, again, a teaching that many people have heard. This is a good place to mention it. Excuse me. That the Zohar, I already mentioned, the Zohar made two predictions. The Zohar, we don't usually think of it as a prophetic work, but it made two predictions. One was that we mentioned already, that by learning the secrets and the teachings of the Zohar, we will merit redemption with compassion. And the second prediction it made was more specific, that in the 600th year of the 6th millennium, the well springs of water from above would burst forth, and the well springs of the abyss or the Tehom from below would burst out, and both of them would flood the world, all in preparation for the Messianic era. So the 600th year, why the 600th year? This is connected to the fact that Noach was 600 years at the time of the flood. And so based on that, that's when this, call it prediction, was made. So the 600th year of the 6th millennium is 1840. Because right now we're in 5784. So 184 years ago, it was 1840. Many people interpret, though, that just like when we have a birthday, when someone is 1 year old, they have finished 1 year already. Now so the whole year, they're 1 year old, but they're really in their second year. And the same with every year after that. So in a certain way, 1840 was the end of a 100-year period that started in 1740. So let's just look quickly what happened between 1740 and 1840. The upper waters, these are the spiritual waters that the Zohar was predicting would flood the world. And the lower waters, this is secular knowledge, scientific advancement, technology. So 1740 is right around what we call the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The steam engine was an incredible revelation. And by 1840 is the beginning, and then you had steamboats. Transportation changed dramatically. By 1840, you had trains. By the end of the 1800s, you had telegraph, Morse code, telephone, the beginning of 1900s, airplane. And then by the 1960s, you have computers, you have spaceships, you have the whole technological revolution, the whole communications revolution. In a relatively short a period of time, the world was flooded and is continuing to be flooded by science and technological advances. What about the spiritual water from above? As we mentioned already, the Baal Shem Tov was born in 1698, and he revealed himself in 1734, when he was 36 years of age. That's right before 1740. And so the revelation of Hasidus represented, until then, Kabbalah was a very secretive, hidden, guarded body of wisdom. The Baal Shem Tov, understanding that we were at the beginning of the Messianic era, so he broke it open. And that's why when he had a vision of the Mashiach, he had what's called an Aliyat Neshama on Rosh Hashanah. And he was in the presence of the soul of Mashiach, and he asked him, when are you coming? And I'm going to backtrack here, because when we were talking before about what would bring Mashiach, so the Baal Shem Tov asked, when is the master coming? And what he was quoting was one of the sages from 1800 years before the Baal Shem Tov, who Yeshua ben Levi, who also found himself in the presence of the soul of Mashiach. And he asked him the same thing, when are you coming? And the Mashiach said, Hayom, today. So Yeshua ben Levi was like, oh my gosh, Mashiach is coming. And so he was like besides himself all day in anticipation. By the end of the day, nothing had happened. Yeshua ben Levi was at a very, very high level. So right after that, he had a revelation of Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Navi. And he said, why didn't the Mashiach tell me the truth? He said he was coming today, and he didn't come. So Eliyahu Navi said to him, you didn't understand. He was quoting a verse that says, Hayom im b'kolo tishma'u. Today, if you meaning all of Israel, would listen to his voice. And actually, we say these words, the first psalm that we sing in Kabbalat Shabbat every Friday night. Hayom im b'kolo tishma'u. Today, if you listen to his voice, that would bring Mashiach. So the Baal Shem Tov asked the same thing, when is the master coming? But this time the Mashiach said, he said, when the well springs of your teachings reach the farthest reaches. And that was the inspiration for the Baal Shem Tov to publicize the inner dimension of the Torah to the farthest reaches. So this idea in the Zohar is very important, just to understand what's happening in the world, that we are actually living through this flood from above and from below. And as the Zohar said, all in anticipation for the coming of Mashiach. So this is a good place to end this class. We are going to continue next week with more about Mashiach. And again, just to remind everyone, the reason that we are concentrating now on Mashiach is because in a whole series about war and peace, so Mashiach represents the culmination of history as we know it, and a culmination of generation after generation, millennium after millennium of war. And the coming of Mashiach represents a new state of consciousness where peace will take over. And that's why, again, Isaiah, the great prophet, said that we will beat our swords into plowshares, and we will no longer learn about war. We'll no longer practice war. So in a series about war and peace in Jewish tradition, discussing Mashiach is really the natural place where all of our learning is going toward, because it is the culmination. And the bracha is that we see the culmination. Right now, we're involved in a very real war. And Bezrat Hashem, this will bring us not just a little closer, but in huge steps towards the eradication of evil and the full redemption of the world.